questions just to the end. So I'll just introduce Andrew now, and we might have time for some questions toward the end. We have Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Chris. It's quite interesting looking at those stats. I realise why my team is so mediocre year on year. And I'm not actually hoping for anything better looking at these very, very slow improvement over the last 10 years. Look, that was really interesting. AFL is a very, very acute case, I guess, in terms of recruitment when you're looking at the players. It becomes a little bit more kind of indicative of a general workplace when you look across whole organisations. But what I want to talk about is legal issues that arise in recruiting. We have got a reasonably finite amount of time, and so while I actually have got three broad topics that I've got on the slide presentation, I'm only going to talk about two of them really in passing, and really going to focus on the issues of discrimination and inherent requirements in recruiting, because I suspect that for most people they are really key issues day to day. So I'll be looking at discrimination, also privacy, and then briefly misleading and deceptive conduct. Chris was talking before about AFL players. I mean, you've got those stats, and I didn't realise that it was quite as detailed as that. But when you're dealing with, say, elite sports people, the issue of inherent requirements, in some ways, is a simpler one. Someone turns up and unsolicited says, "Oh look, I want a meeting with the club. I'm interested in becoming an AFL player, and I want to play with St Kilda, or in my case with Richmond." And actually, in this case, probably wouldn't make them any worse if I did say yes. But someone turns up and they're in a wheelchair, and the conversation goes, and it turns out that they actually are quadriplegic, and so it's not a passing ailment. They're going to be like that for life. Now, obviously, the inherent requirements of the position for an AFL player, mobility is one of them. In fact, a very, very high level of mobility, skill and agility are going to be inherent requirements. So it's not going to be in that situation, although it is discriminatory to say, no, you are in a wheelchair, you are disabled, therefore you cannot meet the inherent requirements and we can't give you a job. Yes, it is discriminatory, but it won't be necessarily unlawfully discriminatory because of the issue of inherent requirements that we'll talk about. However, it's quite a different situation, of course. If someone turns up in a wheelchair and says, "I would like to apply for the receptionist position at Richmond or St Kilda," or even alternatively, you can imagine a circumstance where, for a potentially coaching position, because it's not necessarily an inherent requirement of a coaching role that you are fully mobile. I mean, you've got assistant coaches, you've got all sorts of people who can assist you in the sort of physical aspects, but if you've got the mental aspects and the strategic aspects, then the inherent requirements issue physically is probably going to be quite a different one from what you'll be looking at for one of the players. So inherent requirements as a concept, which I'll be talking about in quite a lot of detail, very much relates to the particular circumstances, and it's something that, as a prospective employer, and this comes up very much in the case of pre-employment screening, but also interviews, you've really got to be very, very clear about the issue of inherent requirements. There is a positive duty not to be discriminatory, and that does apply to employees, to contractors, and all sorts of different areas of sort of commercial interactions. But in this case, let's just talk about job applicants. You can't unlawfully discriminate against prospective employees on the basis of what are called protected attributes. And these appear in state anti-discrimination legislation and federal anti-discrimination legislation. Most of the things that you'd actually think would be protected attributes, can't discriminate against someone on the basis of age, impairment, physical impairment, industrial employment activity, which is basically union membership. And you can see all the way through there that there are largely things that you would think would be protected. Interestingly, the lawful sexual activity example was actually put in there relating to sex work, legal sex work. So if someone actually had a history of being a sex worker, you couldn't discriminate on the basis that they did that, provided it was legal sex work. It wasn't, say, street work, which was unlawful. You can discriminate against people in your day-to-day life. In fact, we all do it. We choose our friends on various bases, and some of them may in fact be unlawful if they were in the context of employment. We are allowed to do it. You're allowed to be a bigot in your own time, but you can't be as a prospective employer. There's two sorts of discrimination, which I'm going to talk about, but both of them also still come back to this issue of inherent requirements. There's direct discrimination, which is really saying, I am not going to employ you because you have this protected attribute. We don't need to say it, you can think it. It's generally going to be deliberate, or if you're not particularly self-aware, it may not be deliberate, but it's going to be pretty obvious. Indirect discrimination is slightly different, because what it is a set of requirements that are being imposed that at face value aren't intended necessarily to be discriminatory, but that certain people with protected attributes can't meet. A really obvious example might be the fact that you've got only stair access to a building. Now that's not discriminatory. You didn't say, well, let's just have stairs because that's going to knock out all those people who are in wheelchairs. You did, but it's unlikely that you did. But it actually does have the effect of being discriminatory because people who aren't mobile are going to have greater difficulty accessing a building than people who aren't. So it's, it's a more insidious version of discrimination because it's, as I said, it's not intended and it's also not necessarily that obvious. The thing that you've got to be mindful of is that when you are running a discrimination claim, or more to the point when you are trying to defend a discrimination claim, in most of the jurisdictions, there is what's called a reverse onus for an employer or prospective employer, which means that you are, as opposed to the thing that we all understand, innocent until proven guilty, you're actually guilty until proven innocent. You've got to establish, once the basic supposition, if a person can establish they've got a protected attribute or that you thought they had one, because it's also unlawful to discriminate against someone because you think they have one. If you think that someone is gay and they're not, and you discriminate against them because you think they're gay and you don't like gay people, it's actually unlawful as well, even if you get it wrong. So, you're kind of a double idiot then because you're discriminating against someone unlawfully, but you're also not actually getting it right. So you've got to be mindful of those things, but indirect discrimination and direct discrimination, if a claim is made, you're coming from a long way behind, and you've got to have some real kind of objectively defensible and sort of positive material evidence and rationale for making the decision that you did to counterbalance the argument that you've done it for an unlawful reason. To give a good example, a fairly simple example of the sort of pitfalls that you can come across as a prospective employer, imagine this scenario. A woman turns up to an interview for a white-collar job and sits down with one of the two people who are going to interview her. The other one has had to tick out to take a telephone call. Says, I'll be back in a minute. Just have a chat and I'll be back and we can start the interview then. So she's sitting down with the other person and they make a little chat. He says to her, oh, do you have children? She said, oh, look, I've got two of them and they're both under 5. How about you? And he says, oh, yes, I've actually got 3. Oh, very, very nice. La, 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 la. The other person comes back in and they start the interview. The interview's going along sort of swimmingly, and at one point in time, the person who had been speaking to her at the start says, there's going to be a fair bit of travel involved and also some late nights and weekend work. Is that going to be a problem for you because you've got young children? She says, no, it's not going to be a problem. I've got a husband who runs a business from home and therefore it's not an issue. Goes to the end of the interview and this person is ultimately not given the job, not because they have, not because of the fact that she's got caring responsibilities, but simply because another candidate was preferred on, let's just say, on an objective basis. Can anyone see any issues arising in that sort of approach? Is there anything that you wouldn't do if you were the interviewer?
You mentioned that would the travel be an issue because they've got the family? That's
right. I mean, what you can do, of course, is you can say that there is a lot of travel as part of this job, and is that something that you're happy to work, within those parameters? You don't need to say, because you have a protected attribute, is that going to be a problem? And that's what people sometimes just don't think. You can actually ask these questions in a way that doesn't zero in on those particular things. So that's exactly right. Don't make the connection. Is there any other problem that you may face, even if you didn't necessarily say you'd make that connection during the interview? Is there an issue with that pre-interview discussion?
Yes.
And why is that?
Right. It's a protected attribute. You just don't ask, in the age of litigation, you just don't ask leading questions like that because it can be used against you.
Look, that's exactly right. And it's innocent. You know, you're trying to make chit-chat. Look, you know, I have young kids, and it is something that I would use. You know, we probably start with the weather and then move on to kids and possibly talk about AFL. But they are areas of you know, making small talk. They're the sort of things you do. But as soon as it's there, the person, if you get to the end of it, end of this process, you've chosen someone else. Now, say for example, using this scenario, take it one step further. When you chose your successful candidate, they had similar qualifications and similar experience. What it came down to is the fact that the person, you know, we all know this when we interview people, has seemed a better fit. Now that seems innocent, you know, we all make those sort of value judgments. You may have two candidates that are on paper that are very similar, and at the end of the day, you just interact with one of them and they just seem to be someone who's going to fit better in the organisation. So, zoom maybe a month ahead, you're in VCAT in the discrimination list, you've got a female barrister cross-examining you on the stand and you're the interviewer, and they said, when you interviewed Mrs. Such and Such, prior to the interview commencing, you asked her about whether she had children. You say yes. And she told you that she had young children. You said yes. And say, I put it to you that you chose another candidate simply because they didn't have young children. And you say that's not correct. And they say, but Mr. Marr, same qualifications, same experience. Why did you choose the other candidate over this candidate? It was because the other candidate didn't have caring responsibilities. So, no, it wasn't that at all. What was it, Mr. Marr? I don't know, it just seemed like a better fit. You're in big trouble. They're a better fit. You've got a reverse onus. It's not going to get you across the line. So, you've got the situation where you actually didn't do the wrong thing. You did actually decide on the basis of well, let's just say, it was not on the basis of that particular attribute, but it's out there, it's the elephant in the room. You've already asked the question. If you hadn't asked that bloody question, you wouldn't be there, because the person might think, oh, well, I think it's probably because I've got kids. But if they don't know you've got kids, then it's very difficult to allege discrimination when the person who's supposedly discriminated against you didn't know what that protected attribute was. And that's often something that comes up in these cases. Someone says, it's because I'm, you know, filling the dots, gay, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, or whatever. But if it's not something that's immediately visually apparent, for example, then, you know, you've got a really good position as the prospective employer who's defending the claim to say, I just didn't know. So how possibly could that be a reason, an unlawful reason for me making this decision? So you've just got to be very, very careful in the kind of questions you ask, and ask them in a way that, again, these are the requirements of the position. You know, are you going to be able to meet them? And you don't have to drill down. It's not your bloody business whether the person has to get their mother to babysit the kids, whether their husband works from home. If they say to you, and you're entitled to rely on it, and it may mean you terminate them later on when they say, actually, I can't travel, I've got kids. It's another issue that, you know, probably warrants a call to me, because it is a little bit complicated. But in reality, if you've laid out what the inherent requirements of the position are, and that may include travel, then you are entitled to rely upon a person's representation to you that they can meet them. Problem is, what are inherent requirements? I had a client ring up. I do a lot of work in the social market research industry. You know, the people that ring you up and annoy you at night and having dinner on the telephone. This person gave me a call and said, look, I've got this problem. He said, I'm recruiting for the telephone interviewers, and I've got this issue that we're getting quite a lot of Indian students coming in. And he said, look, I've got nothing against Indian students at all. But he said, the problem is that, got an Indian accent, when they get on the telephone, we're finding that respondents are immediately assuming they're calling from New Delhi, and it's and then that prejudice kicks in. And then their response rates, I've noticed, are much lower than they are people who've got either, you know, Australian accent or accents deriving from other parts of the world. Because you're not automatically clicking in, I'm just being called from, you know, a call centre in New Delhi. And he said, so, can I screen them out as part of the process? And I said to him, no. I said, what part of an inherent requirement requirement of the job is that. It's not an inherent requirement that you speak without an Indian accent. I mean, it's an inherent requirement that you speak in an intelligible manner. If the person's accent and their spoken English is so poor that they are not intelligible to the average person, okay, they're probably not meeting the inherent requirement of being able to conduct an interview in an effective manner. But simply because it's less likely that they're going to have the same sort of conversion rates that someone who doesn't have that, let's say, attribute, because it could be racial or it could fall into a couple of those different categories. You just can't simply, just because you want it to be a protected attribute, it doesn't become one. So what I said to the guys, I said, look, unfortunately, no, you can't. And yes, that might mean that with these sort of staff, they're going to have lower rates in terms of achievement. But who knows? This person might be fantastic. And okay, it might be an impediment that they've got an Indian accent, but instead of being up here where the next best person's there, they might be here or they might be here. They might still be really good. And if they're not really good, then you've got 6 months if you're sort of 15 plus employees, or 12 months if you've got less than 15 employees, to determine whether they're appropriate for the job before they can run an unfair dismissal claim. So, as long as you did it on proper performance grounds, saying, look, your conversion rate, you might be getting only 10% of people saying yes to an interview as opposed to 25% that the average person in the room's getting. It's a performance-based assessment, it's objective, it's not discriminatory. Okay, the reason why they may not be doing as well may well be their Indian accent, but you're not terminating them because of their Indian accent, you're terminating them because they are simply not performing at the level that you require from your staff. So, again, just because you think it should be inherent, I was using an example, I think, Dean, when I was talking to you about in days past, and I was thinking foreign airlines, it's probably a little bit more permissive, that there probably was a fairly, if not unspoken, it was probably spoken, set of criteria for a hostess on an airline, and and I use hostess as opposed to a less gender non-specific term, in terms of appearance, in terms of, let's just say appearance. Now that quite clearly, and I've been a little uncharitable, but quite clearly that has changed over the years, and you'd say that the recruiting policies of the airlines under anti-discrimination legislation is far broader. And, I would say that probably subject to OH&S guidelines, I don't work for an airline, but, there would be people who are of a certain sort of size may not be suitable because of literally just how narrow the aisles are and the galleys where people are working, and OH&S issues, and certainly for both the staff and also for the passengers in an evacuation scenario. There may be other physical considerations that come into inherent requirements, but it's not going to be that you're 5'10", blonde, slim, and and have nice legs, Whereas in days past, and as I said, I'm still pretty sure that some foreign airlines work on those policies, you can't do it. And just because you want it to be an inherent requirement, if you do want it to be an inherent requirement as an airline executive, it doesn't make it so. So inherent requirements are very important because you've really got to drill down into the role, and they do become complicated because there is actually another overlay on top of it. So you've got discrimination. A defence to it is the inherent requirements of the job are such that it is lawful to discriminate on that basis because the person doesn't meet them. So the first question is, what are the inherent requirements? And you've got to have something that you've really got to, I think, cut down to the real bare bones of what the job requires. And there are going to be, in most jobs, there are going to be inherent requirements that you just can't avoid. I mean, beyond having a pulse, which is going to be an inherent requirement for every job, you can imagine. But if you move on from that, you've really got to be clear because there is going to be a grey area where is it essential? Is it a core part of the role, or is it just something you'd prefer to have in that role? As I said, there's no answers. You're going to have to look at it. But certainly, when you are doing, for example, medical checks for employment, you're going to have to make it pretty clear that there is a obvious nexus between the sort of assessments that you're making and the sort of conclusions that you're going to rely on in saying no to someone potentially and the job itself. you can imagine certain circumstances where the fact that someone does have a particular ailment, whether it's a chronic illness or something like that, where realistically it's actually not going to have that much of an impact on their job, or it might have a bit of an impact. But this is the next thing that's important to understand under anti-discrimination legislation, is you do have to make reasonable adjustments. So if you've got something, an inherent requirement around the edges, reasonable adjustments are still possible. Inherent requirements will still probably trump the obligation to make reasonable adjustments. But say, for example, look, a reasonable adjustment, if you only have got stairs as access to your workplace and someone is in a wheelchair, a reasonable adjustment to accommodate them, if they meet all the other requirements of the job, they've got the right skill set, they've got the right background, what have you, it's not going to be a reasonable adjustment to have to pay to have a lift put in your building solely to accommodate this person. The sort of expense that requires is generally not going to be seen to be a reasonable adjustment. However, of course, if you are a global corporation and this is a major place of employment, it might actually be deemed that because there is going to be more than one person affected by this and it is basically an impediment to a substantial part of the potential workforce, that they actually can't access this building, whether they're in a wheelchair or they're sort of older or whatever, for whatever reason, it may be reasonable. But certainly if you're a small business, to go to that sort of expense is not going to be required by a court or tribunal. So you're not going to have to do that, but you will have to do some things. I mean, whether it's if someone has some visual issues, a larger computer monitor might be sufficient. We're learning more and more about ergonomics and sort of various ways of approaching this type of situation. There may be relatively inexpensive ways of accommodating someone's protected attribute or disability that means that you can't rely on it and say, look, we just simply can't do it. But if someone is applying for a job as a race caller at Caulfield or Flemington and they're blind, this is not going to be a reasonable adjustment. To have someone else whispering in their ear so they can repeat it in their fantastic race calling voice, that's not going to be a reasonable adjustment. But there will be things that, you think at first blush, no, that's not reasonable. Whereas you might end up bearing in mind that these tribunals are often, the people sitting on them are zealots. They don't run businesses. They've never run businesses, and they will have a completely different view, sitting there in judgment on you defending a discrimination claim about what is reasonable and what's not reasonable. And that's, and that also goes for the Fair Work Tribunal as well. The commission members usually aren't from a background of employment, of employers, and again, look at it in a very rarefied, theoretical way and say, yes, you should be able to accommodate that, even if most of us who are just struggling to run our businesses, struggling as may be, most of us would think, it's a fairly significant impost. They might sort of think, well, it's nothing. So you've got to bear in mind that they're going to err on the side of being more generous to protected people with protected attributes than the average person would probably think is justified. How am I going for time? So 5 minutes or? So just to finish off the issue of discrimination, it's unlawful. That's the starting point. Is it direct? Direct's really obvious most of the time, and it's going to be easier to potentially stamp out. Is it indirect? Sometimes you're actually going to be caught out because you're not going to think, well, I didn't realise that actually creates an issue for a person with that attribute. You just haven't thought of it. And that's a situation where you're going to have to ask yourself the next two questions. This relates to direct discrimination as well. Is it an inherent requirement? Firstly, yes or no. Secondly, even if it's an inherent requirement, is there a reasonable adjustment that can be made to accommodate it? If the answer is yes, reasonable requirement, no reasonable adjustment can be made, then you can discriminate. Australian privacy laws, I'll just deal with very, very briefly. Privacy is an interesting area of the law. In some ways it's not a very interesting area of the law either, because sometimes it's much ado about nothing, but sometimes it's not. Employment records are an exempt category which a lot of people don't know. All the obligations with respect to privacy law don't generally attach themselves to employment documentation. So when an employee says, I demand to see my employee file, I want to see that performance review that did. I want to see that complaint that's been made about me. They actually don't have a right to see it. I think they do, but they don't have a right to see it. They have a right to see certain pay records because the Fair Work Act gives you right to access time and wages records to ensure that you comply with all your relevant minimum pay, minimum leave, minimum whatever obligations, but you don't have a right to access your employment file. Unfortunately, many employers don't know that, and then they shake your hand it over, and there's all sorts of comments written about this person by their manager, and all of a sudden there's bullying allegations, and the rest of it writes itself. But Australian privacy laws do attach to prospective employees and the documentation they provide. Now, bearing in mind, especially if you are getting, say, pre-employment screening, you're also going to be dealing with sensitive information, which is a subset of personal information. You can see that personal information is information or opinion that identifies or could reasonably identify a person, whether true or not. It says age, date of birth, phone number, email, all sorts of things. Sensitive information is an information that actually relates in a lot of ways to sort of things like protected attributes. The obligations, although it is only a subset of personal information, the obligations with respect to sensitive information are more onerous. Things like consent really needs to be true informed consent when dealing with sensitive information. It may be a little bit, you might be a little bit, can be a little faster and looser with consent. With other personal information, it can be, for example, it can be to some degree bundled. Yeah, these are all the things we're going to do, and be a little bit non-specific. With sensitive information, it really needs to be specific. When you are receiving this information, not only do you have obligations with respect to, at the time of collection, you've actually got to have a collection statement, and you'll see those on various websites and whatever. This is how we use the information, this is how you can access it, do all these sort of things. There's a set of things that are in the Privacy Act, in the APPs, that you need to do. But also, once you've got the information, that's the collection statement, it's all, you can get a copy of these slides so you can see that. But when you can only you only can try and solicit information that is reasonably necessary. So asking about, say, if someone's got kids, in that situation we talked about before, it's not reasonably necessary, and so therefore it's actually going to be potentially a privacy breach, although a low-level one, to solicit that sort of information. Once you've got the information, you need to secure it. You need to tell the person at the time, and this is dealt with in the collection statement, what you're going to do with it, whether it's going to be transmitted overseas, for example, put in the cloud to be stored. There's a whole set of obligations. You can't keep it for any longer than reasonably necessary. I was speaking to one of my clients who said that they've got recruit job applications that go back 7 years. And I said, well, I mean, they may probably not even living in the same the same address. They're certainly not still, I would imagine, looking for a job with you. Why do you still have it? And they said, oh, we just haven't bothered cleaning it out. With every single one of those records that they've got sitting there, you've got a privacy breach risk. Because if it leaks, if you're hacked, which is usually the way that the leaks sort of come about, you've got an exposure, and there's no reason for it to be sitting there, so it's a breach. I suggest you do have a quick look at these. I've only picked out a handful of the APPs. You can go to the oaic.gov.au, the Privacy Commissioner's website, or Information Commissioner's website, they've got all of them. But you've got to bear in mind that people can also access this stuff and change it. If you don't need it, delete it. It's my recommendation. Lastly, misleading deceptive conduct. This is, again, something that I'm literally going to talk about in the context of these handful of dot points. Be careful about the representations you're making during recruitment. I was involved in a couple of cases where someone was sort of promised a job stupidly before it was signed, moved country to take the job, turned up, and they said, oh, well, no, it hasn't come through. And all of a sudden there was an exposure. What was the representation? Was it a misrepresentation? And was it misleading deceptive conduct? And damages claims can arise. So be mindful about what you're saying pre-employment to people about the employment that's going to be offered to them. That's my final point. I'll be around at the end if you've got any questions. My contact details are there if you have got any questions that you want to deal with later on. But look, thanks for coming down, and I hope that was helpful.
I'm going to jump straight into it. I'm very conscious of time. So I'll probably flip through a few slides, but I just really want to get across the message of pre-employments and what's best practice and what's happening out there currently, and where I think the market's currently moving into. This great slide, the Jetsons back in the day. So I'm looking at a screen. I think as I talk about where the market's going in the pre-employment space, you're going to realise that computers or even big data is really important. The big lead in by Chris was fabulous because I love looking at the way football clubs do their business. I often go to meetings, talk about football clubs, and be very aware that I'm not too blokey when I'm talking about it. But one of the great things they do is they employ beautifully. The way they go through their recruitment process is clearly very thorough, and I would suggest a lot more thorough than any of us here. The way they manage injuries is unbelievable. The way they prevent injuries occurring in the workplace is just a sensational way of going about it. People report things early, people are dealt with early. So they're a really good model for us to base on. It's a great start by Chris and Chris. So, question, put your hand up if you do pre-employments. Keep your hand for me. Come on, put your hands up tall. Come on. Okay, so there's a few of you in the room that do pre-employments. Got a question. Keep your hand up if you do pre-employments to pick a winning team, to win a grand final. So that's your real purpose of the pre-employment. And that's what's different about what most of us do in our organisations to football clubs. So a lot of us are doing pre-employments because we're trying to mitigate the risk of an injury in our workplace. We're not doing them because we want to get the best people in always, and we're not doing it to try and get the most productive team and a winning team. And that's, there's a big difference between football clubs and normal our working environments and what we're trying to achieve. So I always ask the question, why are we doing pre-employments? What's a real purpose? Do we do them to tick boxes? What are we really doing them for? So it's really interesting, the pre-employment space, certainly currently. There's so many different types of pre-employments. Some of us do general pre-employments.
Press it again.
Don't worry, I've got it. Some of us do general pre-employments, and some of our pre-employments are driven by legislation. So, I'm pushing it again. So if you have a look at it, some of us have got, we have to do rail medicals or asbestos medicals. Some of us just do general stuff which is based around physical, functional, it's a medical or a psych component. What I'm going to try to do today is try and break this down and make your life a bit easier so that you can start thinking about what does it take, what's best practice to go pick a winning team, to actually do the right things. Because if you're going to do it, you should do it properly. Otherwise, what are you really doing it for? You're throwing it into a drawer. You do your pre-employment, doctor, physio, whoever it might be, goes, yep, this person's good. Grab them, you might hire them because they meet the inherent requirements of the role, and then you grab that data and you go, plonk, you pop in the drawer, you never see it again. You look at football clubs, they're incredible. They're rating people year on year. They're always looking at what they need, sometimes harder in our environments, but they're always rating people. It's objectified, it's unbelievable. So I'm going to talk a bit about that as we go through today. So the current model is quite confusing. Let's have a look at the evolution of pre-employments and where they've come from. At some point in time, someone said, I want to hire this person, let's check if they can do the job. Send them down to the local doctor. Doctors know everything. They can assess everything that we ever need them to know, and so they send them off to the doctor. That's what they do. And so it started with, let's go send someone to a doctor and get a pre-employment test. Then got a bit better, and maybe a company turned around and said, I've got a test. I prefer that you ask a few more relevant questions to our workplace. And they came up with a standardised pre-employment for their workplace. As it progressed, our pre-employment law, then they decided we wanted something more consistent nationally. So they took their single test and they then handed it out to doctors around the country. Still doctors are doing the law. Then it went to a whole new level. And then we started to look at the inherent requirements of a position. And then companies started saying, okay, if we're going to do a pre-employment, we want you, whoever's doing the test, to understand what is required in this role. It's a whole new level. It's getting closer to things that Chris spoke about. It's starting to require that the person that we're going to employ is actually specific to the task. Unfortunately, and I'll talk about it in a bit, unfortunately what happens is we still have one general test for 15 different roles in our organisation at the end of the day. So we might give the doctor or the physio, whoever it might be, a form that says this individual is a forklift driver or a pilot. They're still often going for very similar, maybe not pilots, but they're often going for very similar tests when they turn up to the doctor. This is where it's going. And this comes back to the football clubs. It's going to become a layered, this is what we believe, it's going to become a layered screening process. It's going to be a little driven by big data, understanding what the general population looks like and how our individuals are scoring against them. Football club analogy was perfect. They measure every player, not just against their own club, but against every other footballer. So it tells them how they're positioned to go and deliver. It tells you as a company how your people how productive they're going to be. We start looking at all the positives and not worrying about whether we're just going to not hurt them when they come to work. So the questions that a lot of businesses ask is, what's the right test for your business? And this comes back to one of the things I was saying before. I think it's the wrong question to be asking. For me, the right question to be asking, and you should all be asking, is what's the right test for each of these individuals? Because it should all be different. So if by chance you employ a pilot, a truck driver and a footballer, which I know none of you do, completely different tests. But again, you're often turning them up, they're going up to a doctor or a physio, or whoever it might be, and they're often doing a very similar test. It's wrong. If you want to get it right, you've got to become more specific in the way you're testing individuals. And that's what it is to make those hard decisions that Owen Joyce, to make the tough decisions. If you want to be ahead of the pack, you've got to be able to turn to your providers and be able to say to them, we actually want you to define your test a little bit differently based on the role. Not just here's the role, do the normal test, but rather give us some different information. And it all starts with this, and it's a job dictionary. Put your hand up if you've got a job dictionary. Great, I'd love to see that. The interesting question is, how many of you send them the task analysis off to the doctor? And how many of you doctors or physios actually read them? Because, we talk about job dictionaries and how valuable they are in the right hands, but what often happens is they'll end up in front of the tester. The tester might look at it, they may not, depending on how busy they are, depending on what the day's like, and then they're going to go and do the same standard test. And then the only thing they may look at is forklift driver. And they'll make all these presumptions of what a forklift driver does. But if you don't have this, you've got nothing to start with. So this is your first point, and this is what you should start using to define your test between your jobs. So let's get away from all the different types of options out there, and let's try and simplify it when it comes to pre-employment testing. The way I see it is there's three major components that we need to test. And depending on the role that you're going for, each one of these pieces of pie should be a different size. So if I jump through it and I look at the next level, I'm conscious of time here. Let's just take a construction worker as an example. What do we know about it? Repetitive work, labour intensive, good hand-eye coordination. Is anyone here in the construction industry? No? Okay. Let's say, for example, I can tell you, we're going to find out in a second, but I can tell you that in construction, if I was saying what's the most common injuries, you're going to tell me probably musculoskeletal, backs, shoulders, necks. That's quite evident by the data, and I'll show it to you. So what should a test look like? When we look at them specifically, we should clearly be honing in on functional assessments. So the body, ligaments, joints, what's their manual handling techniques like? Everything related to the body is the greatest risk. That's what we should be looking at. Not to say there's not a relevant part here. We might need to do drug and alcohol testing. We might need to do blood pressure. There's other very important factors there, but when you look at the data tells us we should be testing mostly functional. So this is from WorkSafe Australia, this data. This is the construction industry. Let's have a look at it. Big things here that you need to understand. Average claim cost is $11,000. More importantly, 53% of the injuries in construction were injuries of traumatic joint, ligament, muscle, tendon. So we come back to the graph before, when we look at most of the testing should be functional, we need to be honing in on what the risks are. We keep going. Of that, 20% was serious back. So if you're going off to get a test done, or your employees are going off to get a test done, and 60% is medical, and 40%, or 30% or even less is functional, you're really testing for the right things. Why are you doing it? My advice is, and I know it's not good advice, you really shouldn't be doing it. There's no value in it. You're going to shove it in a drawer. What's the purpose of it? Why do we do it if there's no purpose? We're spending money on it. I'm going to give you another example. Does anyone here have truck drivers in their business? Right. Can I ask you what would be the biggest issues to truck drivers? If I was just blanket to think about it.
Biggest issue for
Yeah,
us
biggest claims.
is lower back.
Lower So, and that's, again, what we were hearing. Now, truck drivers, certainly larger vehicles, they're driven by legislation. Testing is done by legislation. Someone's gone about several years ago, probably doctors, and they've written this test. And I'm not having to go to doctors, but I'm going to explain to you what we're seeing here. This is a typical test. Conscious of time, so I'm going to hone in. My gut feeling is, and what the data tells us anyway, is that the test should be more, again, have a good functional component. You need to understand things with truck drivers like fatigue management, very important. We need to understand things like fatigue. Heart sounds. There's some certain tests we have to do, there's no question. But if we hone in on what the truck driver medical that gets done every year on these individuals is, if we hone in on it, this is the test that tests their body. So the biggest issue, backs. Back movement, normal, abnormal, delivered by a doctor. In my opinion, a massive amount of information we're missing there. When you think about the biggest claims or the biggest issues you're dealing with in truck drivers, is backs. So, you've got to do this test, and that's okay. But you're already spending the money. My advice in these scenarios is, and whether it's needing a physio or needing more doctor advice, depending on what that pie chart looks like, or psych testing, going to a psychologist or whatever it might be from that angle. If you're doing the test, don't be afraid to spend the extra $100 at that point to go and get a further test done by a specialist that's going to mitigate your risk. So you have to do this by legislation, fine. Then go elsewhere to get something that's just as valid and probably more important to your organisation. And this is what we think it should look like in this space. So, it's about getting the right balance and thinking through that balance. And it might mean that if you've got 20 different job types, you might only have 5 or 6 different types of assessments. You don't need 20, but it's getting that balance amongst your employees. Okay, this is what I love. This is the exciting stuff. This is the innovation. This is where I think it's all going. And it comes back to predictive analysis, which Chris and I actually spoke about on the phone yesterday, which AFL clubs are great at. Some interesting data for you. 4% of companies are now using big data in their recruitment process. 4%. We know football clubs are doing it in Australia, not many others. Some IT companies are using it. We also know that those companies that use big data are 25% more likely to have a better outcome than just human intuition. Sitting in an interview, one-on-one, you do a corporate employment, the reality is you can probably make half of those decisions in an interview one-on-one. You actually don't even go to send a person for the medical. So the data's starting to suggest some interesting things. And where is the world of pre-employment's heading? And it's heading around data. It's trying to objectify things compared to the norm in society. So I've just popped up here one of Chris's slides when he showed us how they rank in the AFL different players and why that's important to them. This is how we think it's going to end up playing out from a pre-employment perspective. An application is received. So they apply for the job, send in their resume. First round of testing is going to be undertaken, and I'll explain more in a second. Then a decision will be made. So you might have an interview with the individual, and you might make a decision based on that. Then we think there'll be another round of testing. So around the physical body, on lesser candidates, which I'll talk about. You make another decision. Hopefully you get the decision right, and then good companies are going to start to collate that data to understand what the norm looks like out there. I'm going to give us a bit of a plug here because I have to at this point. So we're really at the beginning of this right now. We've developed it. We've got this product called the Ready Screen. So it's going to continue to develop over the years, but I'm going to show you where it's sort of heading. The Ready Screen, we've gone away and we've built an online questionnaire with an algorithm in the background that now enables every employer to put their candidates through it and get a risk profile rating at the end of it where they will compare that individual to the general market. So, forklift driver does this questionnaire, they do it at home before they come in for their interview, they get a score rating, 60% based on the questions that we've allocated depending on the specific jobs. They get a score of 60%. Against that, we'll say that the average forklift driver over the last however many years in our system has scored 80%. So what we're trying to do is give employers an understanding of what does the market generally look like and how is this person rated. At a very, I guess the algorithms at its first layer, but at a very simplistic level. So that when you come in for your first layer of interview, really sort of have a feel for where the individual sits and whether they're going to meet the requirements of the job. So at this point, there might be 1,000 people a year we would put through the assessment. Happens before the interview process. What we're hoping is, at this process, which is the pre-employment, now whether we're doing it, Sonic's doing it, the doctor's doing it, doesn't matter, but at this point, it's becoming more specific. And instead of having 1,000 people getting through this point, you've only got 200 people. Because you've been far more informed in the lead up to that decision. So from a cost point of view, we think it's going to be far more beneficial for employers. But the better layer is, you'll have a much better understanding of where these individuals sit as compared to the market. So hopefully, it means that using data and objectifying things, you'll be able to pick a winning team at the end of the day, a better team to be able to perform in the jobs, whilst you're still mitigating their risk further down the path by doing the more in-depth testing at this layer where it's dividing up. As companies, pre-employment testing companies get better, they're going to start to gather this data. We do it, again, right now we do it at a very low level. It's going to get much better in the years to come, not by us, by everyone, where all of a sudden the information that's been gathered at this layer will be delivered back in formats to the client to be able to show them, one, how their candidates went, whether they presented for a claim in the first 6 months, if they did, or an injury of any sort. So you can start understanding better, are we hiring the right people, are we doing it right, do we need to adjust our testing in some way. And that's how big data is going to eventually feed into the pre-employment process, very similarly to the way AFL clubs do it. So really, it's just every business is at some point, one of these blocks. If you're not there yet, you need to get yourself to here. You need to make sure that you are tailoring your pre-employment in some layer to a good job dictionary that is easy to read, very simple. Because most health professionals just don't have time. They're going to tell you they do, but they don't go through it properly enough. That's what we are, to make it good, easy to read, and make sure whoever's delivering your test knows your workplace. That's where it's going to head, and you can start preparing for that. So I guess in summary, I know we're conscious of time really quickly. Really interesting to hear Chris talk about how the AFL does things. I love it. I just think it leads the way for all of us to understand how do you pick the best team and only focus on winning, not worry about just losing, a positive attitude. We've had Andy talk about our inherent requirements and how important it is to make sure you understand what your task analysis job dictionary looks like and the person actually fits the role and you're making the decisions based on the position. And I'm just trying to give you a feel for what the future probably looks like in pre-employments and what best practices are out in the market. That's it. Thank you for your time. And thank you.
Guys, I'm very mindful of time. It's just after 10 o'clock and some of you may have to move on. Before you leave, thank you very much for joining. If you do have any questions at the moment to ask Chris, Andrew or Dean, feel free to do so now. We'll take a couple of questions first. From anyone else?
Can't hold people back.
It's a question for Chris. When you're talking about your core values, I'm interested to understand how you assess the presence of those core values within the candidates.
Yeah, if they're specific to our cultural values, and we do psych testing on all the players, so fundamentally the AFL understand the psych process they go through, and then the clubs get to interview all players as often as they want prior to selection. So if it's more based on performance, then we use data even at the junior level players who are under-18 level, the champion data now do it at under-18 level Australia-wide. So.
Yes, sir.
Dean, question for you. With the ready screen process, the front end, it's a mixture of medical kind of questionnaires, is it? Or
There's a psych test, it's a CAT-10, which is the online test in there. There's a lot of medical-based questions, there's past history questions. So we basically looked at our last 10 years of what we call our higher and longer employment, combine that with a lot of the data that's sitting out there and try to come up with a formula,
so it picks up kind of at-risk kind of behaviour, candidates in that process as well.
Correct.
So those ones that tend to end up hurting themselves.
As well as it can for its
Yeah.
first iteration, absolutely.
Yep.
I mean, ultimately we want to do that software. It's never ending. I'm sure everyone here deals in software in some way. It's never ending. But we built it. We thought it was great. Now we want to keep going and we build a second layer. Certainly that's that we're continuing to improve in that space. We've got a layer, but now we're going to get tighter as time progresses.
Yes.
Yeah, question for Chris. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you for that. I was really interested in the predictive analytics component. So typically I would imagine that most of the people that you're benchmarking look at data actually performing on that job, i.e. playing footy, and that's how you're analysing them. I call it the Jared Hayne effect of not knowing which sport you're going to play next week. Do you do anything that kind of assesses the performance of people in other industries? Because typically in the field for us, we're recruiting from other industries, people who have kind of skills not necessarily on that current job. So what do you do in terms of predictive analytics of looking at people maybe in other sports, their suitability for roles, etc.?
Yeah, look, that's growing in the AFL all the time, especially if you look at now players from New Zealand who Auckland led the way into New Zealand. Thankfully, we're trying to duplicate that now. Transferable qualities, particularly around athletic. If a player jumps or can run fast or his agility, they're all testing that's done standardised now across from over 17 onwards. So they're the most important in terms of transferable qualities and the psychoanalysis. Those two we find are transferable from sport to sport. Specific skill components, which we know different to your own businesses, are specific to your own workplace, where we may not be able to assess a player from America's kicking ability, will certainly be behind even a junior player at this level. But if he's got the athletic qualities, we believe with intense training, that we can actually bring those up to speed. So hence why you're now seeing players like Mason Cox at Collingwood, who had never played football before 6 months ago. He's now playing at the highest level because of either the combination of psych and athletic testing.
Just have one question actually for Andrew. Often I get asked when we're talking about pre-employments with clients, we've had someone come into a medical, they didn't get a job with us, it was because they just didn't meet the inherent requirements, whatever generalised term. Who actually owns that pre-employment? I mean, the client has paid for it, but the candidate, or prospective candidate, didn't get the job. So where does that information sit? Who owns it? Is it the provider? Is it the client? Does the candidate have access to it? Are they allowed it? Where does it sit?
Well, I guess the answer to the first question is it's going to come down to the contract that you have or the T's and C's of the assessment. I suppose what's more important is your second question is can the candidate get access to it? Yes, they certainly can, because we talked about private information, personal information under the Privacy Act. They have right to access it, correct it if it's not right, and while they don't own it, because it will come down to whoever's sort of effectively paid for it, collected it, and will be the terms of that collection, but they do actually have access to it. So the fact that you're saying, well, it's not based on inherent requirements, and they say, well, actually, I want to see it. Well, ultimately, they might, depending on who owns it, they might actually have the right to go and see it. Now, if you're holding it, even if you don't own it, they have the right to go to you and say, I want to access it. And you have an obligation to respond to them, ultimately, as long as it's not unnecessarily complicated and expensive and difficult, or risky often safety to do it, you have to give access.
So as simple as someone can come to this office, I can put it up on a computer screen for them to scroll through their report, and then they can make some notes if they want to actually call the prospective employer and say, you said I didn't meet the requirements, but yet I smashed my whole assessment up.
Yeah, they certainly do that.
And in terms of, say, for us as health professionals, or for any health professional who does this, how long does the health professional have to keep the records? Because medical records have to be kept for, say, up to 7 years.
Yeah.
Is this considered a medical record?
It would depend what's in there. I mean, under most circumstances, I wouldn't have thought that, as a prospective employer, I would have thought that really you wouldn't want to necessarily delete it straight away because you want to be able to defend claims. But after about 12 months, you'd probably want to start looking at the destruction of that data or de-identification of it or whatever you need for other purposes. But to start moving it from that sphere of personal information to, as I said, de-identified information before things like that. Don't hold it for 7 years would be my thought. If you are someone who has simply got that information because you're a prospective employer.
Okay, as health professionals.
As health professionals, I'm not sure. You've got a whole set of different obligations under the Health Records Act, and I would have thought that probably as health professionals, 7 years is just off the top of my head would be the thought.
What's the time frame that someone can lodge a discrimination claim?
It's generally 12 months.
Okay.
However, if you want to run a general protections claim under the Fair Work Act, it's 21 days, so it's much shorter.
Just a follow-up question, Andrew. I've got a client at the moment. One of the things I'm concerned about with them is the way that they collect private information of claims, health information for individuals. So whether it be a workers' comp or a salary continuance claim, typically the employee would fill in a form, a claim form. Now, under normal circumstances, for most clients, we see those go straight to the insurers and there's an assessment done. This client has actually put in place a process. They say, send all of your claim forms to us, we will then forward them on. And they are saying then that they have got implied consent that that medical information is now shared with the employer. The employer could use that, this is the HR director, to say, well, this is someone we want to get out of the business, this is someone we want to get. I'm concerned that there's kind of some issue there in what they're doing and whether they need to be careful about that. Just your thoughts.
Now, well, that's a really good question, but if they're a prospective employee, again, it falls within the Privacy Act.
Yeah.
You've got to, at the time of collection, you've got to get consent, especially for some of the sensitive information. If you are saying, give it to us solely for the purpose of us conveying it to a third party, then ultimately you don't have the authority under the Privacy Act to view it yourself and use it for your own purposes, because that is not the purpose of collection and the person hasn't consented to it. If you've said, however, we may also view this information and then obviously you're going to be able to do it. But you've got to get consent for a use unless it's sufficiently connected to that primary purpose of collection that you can get it under the initial consent. You really do need to have a separate consent for that specific use, like HR using it for other screening purposes. So yes, you're right. There's a potential privacy risk in terms of being an interference with privacy. If you suddenly grab it out of the process because you're a mailbox effectively and use it for your own reasons.
Thank you.
Guys, thank you very much. Oh,
Sorry,
question.
Dean, one quick question. Around pre-employment medicals, I'm just interested in your thoughts around what Bodycare is seeing from an industry perspective around who's got, at the moment, robust processes or requests in place around what they're wanting to cover off from a pre-employment medical perspective.
As in verticals, industries that are leading the
Yeah,
way?
in your view, what Bodycare is saying?
Yeah, look, to be honest, it's very company dependent. It's actually not related to any vertical. It's every company we deal with, they're at a different stage in their process, as you all know. And some of our companies are far, they'll come to us to come with a manual, which we love, they want to be more specific, and some of them, they don't. We're forever trying to drive a more specific process, but it's always about engaging with the client and working out where they are and not pushing beyond boundaries. So there's no exact science to that, to us. It's really related to each company that builds it.
And I think it also depends on the industry they're in as to what they legislatively have to do versus, if
unless it's legislative.
Mandatory versus
Correct.
Exactly. Thank you very much. If you've got any other questions for our speakers today, feel free to have a chat. They're going to be hanging around for a few minutes. There's the coffee. There's plenty of Danish fruit. Feel free to good night and thanks very much for attending.